Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at a really cool economic study guide. We're going to be exploring some of the core ideas that kind of underpin, how economies work. But don't worry, we're not going to make this a snooze fest.
Definitely not. We're going to be pulling out the gems, the stuff that makes you go, oh, I never thought about it like that before.
Exactly. And by the end of this deep dive, you're going to have a solid understanding of how these, foundational economic ideas actually impact your everyday life.
Absolutely. From, why concert tickets are so expensive to how governments decide to, spend their money. It's all connected.
Okay, so Chapter 1 of this study guide just jumps right into it, with the concept of scarcity. It basically lays out this fundamental economic problem. We all have unlimited wants and needs, but the resources we have to satisfy them, those are limited. So how do we even begin to make sense of that?
Well, that's where the whole idea of choice comes in, right? Think about it. You only have so much time and money, yeah. So every decision you make means you're saying yes to something, and at the same time, you're saying no to something else.
So it's a constant trade-off.
Exactly. And that's the core of economics, understanding those choices that individuals and societies as a whole are making all the time in the face of scarcity.
And it's not just about things that we usually think of as scarce, like diamonds or oil. This document even uses the example of air, which we normally think of as free. But pollution shows how even something we have a ton of can actually become scarce when, there are competing demands for it.
Totally. And, this chapter really emphasizes how economics, it's about more than just money. It's about understanding those trade-offs that we're making with all of our resources, our time, our energy, even our attention.
So it's really about making the most of what we've got.
Exactly. This document wants you to understand that because resources are limited, we have to prioritize. And that has implications for everyone from individuals to entire nations.
Speaking of nations, this chapter also talks about factors of production. These are the building blocks of, producing anything. It breaks them down into these four main categories: natural resources, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship.
And what's cool is how this document wants us to think about capital as being more than just money. It's really about the tools and machines and infrastructure used in, producing stuff. It's the stuff that helps us transform those natural resources and, use labor to turn them into actual goods and services that we use every day.
Oh, and of course, we can't forget about the entrepreneurs.
Oh, definitely not.
They're the ones taking risks and driving innovation. I bring everything together. They're a vital part of economic progress. And this document really stresses how each of these factors, natural resources, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, each one is essential for production. And societies need a good balance of all four to really thrive.
For sure. And understanding these factors helps us see how interconnected everything in the economy really is. Even a shortage of one resource, that can totally ripple through the whole system. It can have all these unintended consequences. This document really wants you to start thinking about those complexities of production and, appreciate the value of every ingredient in the recipe for economic success.
Right, because if even one ingredient is missing, the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly.
So Chapter 2 kind of takes us behind the curtain and shows us how economists, actually do economics. It talks about the economist's toolkit, which sounds a lot, cooler than it probably is.
Actually, it kind of is like a detective's toolkit in a way. You see, economists use the scientific method to investigate, all those economic happenings out there. They make these hypotheses, they gather all this data, they test their theories, and they use models to analyze specific parts of the economy. It's pretty fascinating.
So they're like economic detectives.
Uh-huh. Yeah, kind of. Think of these models as simplified representations of the real world that help economists zero in on and understand these key relationships. They're maps that guide them through all the complexity.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
So what are some of the, essential tools in this economic toolkit?
Well, one of the biggies is the concept of get ready for it, ceteris paribus. It's Latin, and it basically means all else equal. And it's super important.
Oh, yeah, I remember that from Econ 101.
It allows economists to really focus on the impact of changing just one variable at a time while holding everything else constant.
It's a way to kind of control for how crazy and complicated the real world is, right? A way to isolate those cause and effect relationships.
You got it. And this chapter wants you to understand, like, how challenging it actually is to study economics. It's not a controlled lab experiment, you know? Things are always changing out there.
And that's why economists have to be super careful about jumping to conclusions based on data, right? Correlation doesn't always equal causation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other.
100%. This document uses the example of gas prices and consumption. If gas prices go up and people start buying less gas, it might seem like, oh, well, of course, the higher prices cause a lower consumption, but what if there's something else going on?
Like maybe a recession that makes people drive less or, more fuel-efficient cars becoming popular.
Exactly. Economists use all these different tools and techniques to try to untangle those complex relationships and figure out what's actually driving those trends we see. It's like detective work, remember?
So they're looking for clues to solve the economic mysteries. I like that. Okay, so another important point that this document highlights is the difference between positive and normative economics, right?
Oh, well, absolutely. That's huge. Positive economics deals with objective facts, things you can test and measure, while normative economics is all about value judgments and opinions.
So it's like the difference between what is and what should be.
Exactly. And it's so important to be able to tell those two apart, especially when it comes to debates about economic policy. Like saying the unemployment rate is 5%, that's a positive statement. It's a fact. But saying the government should increase the minimum wage, that's a normative statement. It's based on someone's opinion about what's best.
And both are totally relevant to economic discussions, but they serve different purposes.
Right. This chapter really wants you to, develop that critical thinking muscle, be able to spot bias and evaluate arguments based on their underlying assumptions. And to understand that economists, just like everyone else, can have different opinions and interpretations of the same data.
Because economics isn't just about cold, hard numbers. There's a lot of human judgment involved, too.
Absolutely. Okay, so speaking of different perspectives, Chapter 2 also introduces this key distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics.
Oh, right, the zoom in, zoom out thing.
Yeah, exactly. Microeconomics is all about zooming in on the decisions made by individuals, households, and firms, and how those decisions affect, specific markets.
It's like looking at the trees. Right?
Yeah. Whereas macroeconomics is like zooming out and looking at the whole forest. It's about the overall performance of the economy, stuff like inflation, unemployment, economic growth, and government policies that impact the entire system.
So it's like microeconomics might help us understand why, the price of our favorite coffee went up, while macroeconomics would look at those broader trends like, rising inflation. That's affecting the prices of, everything in the economy.
You got it.
Okay, so we've got the fundamental problem of scarcity, right? We got the economist toolkit, and we've got this big picture of micro versus macro. Now, Chapter 3 jumps into how societies actually organize their economies to deal with that, whole scarcity thing. It's about, like, who gets to call the shots, who decides what to produce, how to produce it, and who ultimately gets to consume it.
It's like, who's running the show? And there's this whole spectrum of ways societies can do that, right? You have traditional economies, which are really rooted in, customs and traditions that have been passed down through generations.
So it's like, this is how we've always done it.
Right. And then you have command economies, where the government pretty much controls everything. They control the means of production. They make most of the economic decisions. It's like, central planning. And then there are market economies.
Where it's all about supply and demand, right?
Exactly. Decisions are mostly decentralized, driven by those market forces. Prices are the signals that tell people what to produce and consume.
It's like an invisible hand guiding the economy.
Yeah, that's a classic analogy. But here's the thing. Most economies in the real world aren't pure examples of any one system. They're usually mixed, blending elements of all three. The document points out that even in societies with strong, free market principles, there's still a role for government, like to regulate certain industries, provide public goods, and, deal with those situations where the market isn't working quite right.
Right, because sometimes the market needs a little nudge in the right direction.
Exactly.
So this chapter wants us to really see the variety of economic systems out there, right? To understand that each approach comes with its own, advantages and disadvantages. There's no one-size-fits-all perfect system.
Exactly. And one key takeaway from this chapter is the importance of property rights in any economic system.
Oh, yeah. Because when people feel confident that they actually own stuff and that those rights are going to be protected, they're more likely to invest, innovate, and, well, that ultimately leads to economic growth.
Exactly. And conversely, when property rights are weak or, not enforced very well, it can really hold back economic progress. This document highlights how the clarity and enforcement of property rights can make or break a country's economic success in the long run.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of conceptual stuff so far, but now, it's time to get a bit more visual. Chapter 4 introduces the production possibilities curve, which is this cool graphical tool that helps us understand those trade-offs that societies have to make when they're deciding what to produce with their limited resources.
It's a way to illustrate the concept of opportunity cost, like really see it in action. The curve shows all the possible combinations of two goods that an economy can produce, given its current resources and technology.
Okay, so can you give us like an example?
Yeah, for sure. Imagine a country that can only produce two things: cars and computers.
Okay, so a super simplified example.
Yeah, exactly. So the production possibilities curve shows all the different combinations of cars and computers that country can produce when it's like operating at peak efficiency, using all its resources.
And this curve, it's not just a straight line, right?
No, it's usually bowed outwards, and that's important because it represents the idea of increasing opportunity cost. What that means is, as you produce more and more of one good, you have to give up increasingly larger amounts of the other good.
So the trade-offs aren't always one for one.
Exactly. And this chapter wants you to grasp that idea that, specializing in producing one thing can come at a steeper and steeper cost as you make more and more of it.
So what about economic growth? How does that factor into this?
Oh, that's represented by the whole curve shifting outwards. So it's like the country can now produce more of both cars and computers. And that happens when there are improvements in technology or increases in resources or investments in human capital that make the economy, overall more productive.
So we can actually push those boundaries of what's possible.
Exactly. This document wants you to get that. How investments today can create more opportunities for us in the future.
Okay, so we've looked at graphs. But if you thought that was the most exciting thing we were going to cover, well, buckle up. Chapter 5 brings us the circular flow model, which is a visual way to understand how money, goods, services, and resources are all flowing between different parts of the economy.
It's like a map of the entire economic ecosystem.
A roadmap for how everything works.
Yeah. And the model focuses on these two main players: households and firms. Households, those are the consumers. They own the factors of production labor, land, capital, and they sell those factors to firms in exchange for income.
And then those firms use those factors of production to produce the goods and services that they sell back to households.
Right. So it's this continuous cycle. Money flows from households to firms when they buy stuff, and then it flows back to households as wages, rent, interest, and profits.
It's like a constant exchange of resources and money. It's actually pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is. And this document uses the circular flow model to show how interconnected everything in the economy really is. It shows how decisions made by households and firms impact each other and drive, all that overall economic activity. They break down this flow into two main markets.
So there's the factor market, where households sell their factors of production to firms. And then there's the goods market, where firms sell their goods and services to households.
You got it. It's a really helpful way to see how everything's linked.
The big economic puzzle, and each piece fits together.
Yeah, kinda. And it helps us understand how a change in one part of the circular flow can totally ripple through the whole system, like a chain reaction. For example, if people start spending less, that can lead to lower demand for goods and services, which can then lead to firms cutting back on production and, maybe even laying off workers. And that impacts household income, which then impacts spending even further.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly.
So what this chapter wants us to take away is that the economy is this dynamic system where all the parts are always interacting and influencing each other. It's constantly moving and changing.
For sure. It's not static at all. All right, so now we're getting to the heart of how markets actually work. Supply and demand. It's like this concept that gets thrown around all the time. But the study guide breaks it down in a way that's surprisingly clear.
Yeah, it's kind of like this dance between buyers and sellers, right? And the music they're moving to is price. So let's start with demand.
Okay, so the document really emphasizes that demand isn't just about wanting something. It's about being willing and able to actually buy it at a specific price. They use this great analogy. Imagine a bunch of students who love pizza. They're definitely willing. But if they're all broke, their collective demand isn't going to be very strong.
So you need both the desire and the, purchasing power to actually be a player in the market.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what are some of the, other factors that can influence demand?
Yeah. What else is going on?
Well, this document lists a few key ones, like people's tastes and preferences, obviously, their income levels, the price of the good itself, how many potential buyers are out there, and even the prices of related goods. They even talk about how things like the weather can impact demand, like a heat wave might make people crave ice cream, while a blizzard could send them running for hot chocolate.
It's so interesting how something like the weather can play a role in, the economy. Who would have thought?
Right, it's all connected. So how do economists actually visualize this relationship between price and quantity demanded?
Yeah, how do they make sense of all that?
That's where the demand curve comes in. It's like a graphical representation of the law of demand. And this document really wants you to understand this law. The higher the price of a good, the lower the quantity demanded. Assuming everything else stays the same. Ceteris paribus, remember?
Okay.
Yeah.
Our old friend.
Exactly. So the demand curve slopes downwards, showing that as the price drops, people are generally willing to buy more. Like the document uses movie tickets as an example. If tickets are $15, maybe 100 people will go. But if the price drops to $10, you might get 200 people heading to the cinema.
Makes sense. The cheaper it is, the more people will buy.
Exactly. Now remember that the demand curve only shifts when something other than the price of the good changes. Like if something like income levels or consumer tastes shifts, the entire demand curve will move.
So if a new study comes out saying that dark chocolate is like a superfood, we might see the entire demand curve for dark chocolate shift to the right. More people are willing to buy it at any given price.
Exactly. And the document gives a similar example, but this time it's about fried chicken. Like if people suddenly decide they don't like fried chicken anymore, maybe because of health concerns, that demand curve shifts to the left, meaning fewer people are willing to buy it at any price. This document wants you to understand that demand shifts are about more than just a change in price. They reflect these broader changes in consumer behavior or, market conditions.
It's like a whole cultural shift can impact those curves.
Totally. So we've got demand down. What about the other side of the equation? Supply.
Okay, let's talk supply. What's that all about?
Supply is all about the producers, the businesses and individuals who create and sell goods and services. It's about their willingness and ability to, provide those goods and services at different prices.
So it's not just about how much of something exists, but how much producers are actually willing to sell at each price point.
You got it. And a huge factor influencing supply is the cost of production. Like if the price of ingredients, labor, or energy goes up, producers might have to reduce how much they're willing to supply at each price. This document wants you to understand that producers are also making choices based on their own constraints and incentives.
It's like a bakery, right? If the price of flour, sugar, and eggs suddenly skyrockets, they'll either have to raise their prices or bake fewer cakes to make ends meet.
Exactly. The document uses a similar example with soft drinks. If aluminum cans get more expensive, the supply curve for canned beverages could shift, reflecting that increased cost.
So there's like a ripple effect from those input costs.
Well, sure. What other things affect supply, you ask?
Yeah, what else are we thinking about here?
Well, technology is a big one. A new, more efficient production method could increase supply, shifting the curve to the right. And then there are government policies. Like stricter environmental regulations might increase production costs and decrease supply, while subsidies for renewable energy could boost the supply of solar panels. The number of suppliers in the market also matters. More competition usually leads to a greater supply.
Okay, so lots of factors can come into play.
Right, so just like with demand, there's a supply curve to represent this relationship between price and quantity supplied.
Okay, and what does that look like?
It usually slopes upwards, illustrating the law of supply. As the price of a good rises, producers are generally willing to supply more of it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If the price of gold jumps, we'd expect mining companies to ramp up production, hoping to, cash in.
Exactly. That upward slope reflects how higher prices incentivize producers to bring more goods to the market. And this document wants you to see that supply and demand aren't just these abstract concepts. They're driven by the real-world decisions of businesses and consumers responding to price signals and incentives.
It's all about those incentives.
Absolutely. Now, this document gets even more interesting when it starts talking about substitutes and complements, both in production and consumption.
Okay, so remind me what those are again.
Substitutes in production are when producers can use the same resources to make different products. Like, think about farmers who can choose to plant corn or soybeans depending on which crop is fetching a higher price.
So if soybean prices soar, we might see fewer farmers planting corn and more focusing on soybeans. That would decrease the supply of corn and increase the supply of soybeans.
Exactly. Now, complements in production are goods that are produced together, like beef and leather. You can't have one without the other.
So an increased demand for beef, leading to more production, would likely also increase the supply of leather, even if the demand for leather itself hasn't changed.
You got it. And on the consumption side, we have substitutes as well, goods that can be used in place of each other, like tea and coffee. If coffee prices go up, people might switch to tea, leading to a decrease in demand for coffee and an increase in demand for tea.
Well, that's a good example.
Right. And then there are complements in consumption, like peanut butter and jelly. They're usually consumed together. So if the price of peanut butter drops, leading to more people buying it, we'd probably also see a rise in demand for jelly.
It's all connected.
This document wants you to understand that these relationships between substitutes and complements can totally have a ripple effect throughout markets influencing prices and production decisions.
So all these forces are constantly interacting, pushing and pulling on prices and quantities. But where do they all meet?
That's where market equilibrium comes in, the grand finale of supply and demand.
It's that sweet spot in the market where the quantity demanded by buyers equals the quantity supplied by sellers.
Right, exactly. And graphically, it's where the demand curve and supply curve intersect. This document wants you to really visualize that point of balance.
So if the price is above equilibrium, there's a surplus. Sellers are trying to sell more than buyers want at that price.
And that usually pushes the price down as sellers try to get rid of their extra inventory.
Makes sense. But if the price is below equilibrium, we have a shortage. More buyers want the product than sellers are offering.
Right, and that typically drives the price up as buyers compete for the limited supply.
So the market is constantly adjusting, trying to find that balance point where everyone's happy.
Exactly. This document even dives into the concept of total surplus, which is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. It basically represents the overall benefit created by a market transaction.
Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure. The document uses fried chicken as an example again. Let's say the market price for a piece is $4. Some people might be willing to pay $5 or even $6, so they're getting a great deal that's consumer surplus. And some producers might be willing to sell for $3 or even $2, so they're also benefiting that's producer surplus.
So everyone's winning in a way.
Yeah, kinda. The document emphasizes that market equilibrium is where that total surplus is maximized, meaning the market is operating efficiently and creating the most value for both buyers and sellers. It's like a win-win situation.
But what happens when things get disrupted? When something throws that delicate balance of supply and demand out of whack?
That's where things get, really interesting. How does the market actually respond when something throws off that balance of supply and demand? This document, walks us through some scenarios.
So let's stick with our fried chicken example. Okay, imagine that. Like suddenly there's this huge fried chicken craze sweeping the nation. Everyone's got to have it.
So at every price, people are suddenly willing to buy way more fried chicken, right? So that means the demand curve is shifting to the right.
Okay, so we've got this big shift in demand. What happens next?
Well, that shift creates an imbalance in the market. At the original equilibrium price, there's now way more demand than supply, so we have a shortage. And this document explains that shortages put, upward pressure on prices.
That makes sense, right? If there's not enough to go around, the price is going to go up.
Exactly. And as the price starts going up, two things happen. First, the quantity supplied increases because, producers are incentivized to make more fried chicken at that higher price. They're like, hey, we can make more money here. And second, the quantity demanded goes down a bit because, some people just can't afford it anymore at that higher price, or they decide to buy a little less.
So the market kind of corrects itself.
Right. And that price adjustment keeps happening until we hit a new equilibrium. That new equilibrium point will be at a higher price and a higher quantity than before. So an increase in demand, it actually leads to both a higher price for fried chicken and more fried chicken being sold.
So even though the price goes up, more people are actually getting their fried chicken fix.
Exactly. Okay, now let's flip it and look at a decrease in demand. What if, say, people suddenly become super wary of fried food because of, a big health scare or something?
So in that case, the demand curve shifts to the left, right? People are willing to buy less fried chicken at every price.
You got it. And now we have a surplus. At the original price, producers are supplying way more fried chicken than people actually want.
So now there's too much fried chicken. What happens then?
Well, that surplus puts downward pressure on the price. As the price starts falling, the quantity supplied decreases as producers scale back. They're like, okay, maybe we don't need to make as much fried chicken anymore. And at the same time, the quantity demanded increases a bit because that lower price entices some buyers to come back. They're like, hey, fried chicken's a good deal now.
So the market Again, kind of self-corrects, but this time in the opposite direction.
Exactly. So we end up at a new equilibrium point, but this time with a lower price and a lower quantity than before.
So those shifts in demand, they really ripple through the market, affecting both the price and the quantity.
Absolutely. This document wants you to see those dynamics at play.
So we've seen how demand shifts can really shake things up. What about shifts in supply? What if, say, there's this new technology that, like, lets chicken farmers raise chickens way more cheaply?
Oh, that would totally increase the supply of chicken, right? Shifting that supply curve to the right.
And at that original price, there'd be a surplus of chicken, right?
Yeah.
More chicken than people want at that price.
Exactly. So the price starts to drop. As the price falls, the quantity demanded increases because, people are like, ooh, chicken's on sale, let's buy some. And eventually a new equilibrium gets established. This new equilibrium will have a lower price and a higher quantity than before.
So that's actually pretty cool. Those technological advancements that lower production costs, they can actually benefit consumers by making things more affordable.
Right. This document really wants you to understand those connections, how changes on the supply side can have these real impacts on what you see in the market, on the prices you pay for things.
Okay, so we've looked at what happens when demand shifts. We've looked at what happens when supply shifts. But what if they both shift at the same time? What happens then?
That's when things get really interesting and, a bit more complex. This document explains that it really depends on, the direction and the size of those shifts. For example, if demand increases while supply decreases, well, we know the price is going to go up for sure. Both those shifts are pushing the price in that direction. But what happens to the quantity, that's a little more uncertain. It all depends on which shift is stronger.
So it's like this tug of war between those two forces.
You got it. And this document gives this real-world example. The chicken market in Hong Kong during a bird flu outbreak. The outbreak reduced the supply of chicken, so that shifted the supply curve to the left. But at the same time, fear of shortages probably increased demand, so that shifted the demand curve to the right.
So you had these two opposing forces working at the same time.
Right. And the combined effect, well, the price of chicken shot way up, but what happened to the quantity, that wasn't as clear-cut. It all depended on whether the supply decrease or the demand increase was, more significant.
That's a great example of how these seemingly abstract models of supply and demand can actually help us understand those real-world events.
Exactly. This document wants you to take these concepts beyond the textbook and, apply them to the world around you.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive. From scarcity and opportunity cost to the dynamics of supply and demand, we've explored those core principles of economics.
And we've seen how economists think, the tools they use, and how those ideas actually play out in our everyday lives.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Think about a recent news headline about the economy. Maybe it's about, rising inflation or a housing shortage. How can you use the concepts we've talked about today to understand what's going on, to make sense of those complexities of the economic world around you? Keep those economic minds sharp.